Okay, here's a big conspiracy theory. Lawyers raised from the dead. When the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin, what are we accomplishing? They asked. Here's the man performing many signs. This is right after old Lazarus got resurrected. Let's see. After 4 days, they gathered the high priests and Pharisees of council and said, "What do we? For this man doeth many miracles." The synagogue, they led together. I'd already gone through this last week. There are some really important words used in here. They get translated a little differently. I'll give you the translation because we already went to that before. Accordingly, the chief priests and Pharisees led together a sitting together with. It's the sitting together with is called directly the Sanhedrin. That's the 72. What do you call them? Supposed elders, and at the time we know that the 72 included 4 Pharisees. So most of them were the Sanhedrin were Sadducees. And they were making a logical argument. What are we to do? Because he, the man, makes or does many supernatural ceremonial indications. Semeion. He makes many semeion. By the way, what's really interesting, and I should have grabbed this from when we looked at the feeding the 5,000, but the same term that's used for gathering excess bread and fish together in feeding the 5,000 is also used in this section. And, John doesn't just pick words because they're cute to use, right? John picks words, obviously, that mean something in context of his logos for a telos. And so when the disciples gathered together the excess, they called it, they used the same term, that they led together, a sitting together, they led together the remainder of the fish and the bread. That same term is used, right? It's not usually used of fish. So it's very interesting. It's not used of fish and bread. It's usually used of people being led together. So what John is doing is he's pointing out that this semeion this miracle is similar, and the Pharisees and Sadducees, especially the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin coming together is like the disciples gathering together the fish and the bread that's left over. And I think this is both an irony and a satire, because the irony is that what does it mean that you gather together the leftovers, right? What does it mean? The leftovers have no effect anymore on the people. The leftovers are helpless, right? The leftovers are just leftovers. They may get eaten by the disciples, they may get eaten by somebody, but they're still just what's left over. And so I think there's a connotation here, because look at what they continue to say. Number one, you have it gives a plural for the chief priests or high priests. How many are they supposed to be?
One.
Yeah. How can you have multiple high priests? It's not possible, right? That's an impossibility. What it shows, this shows, and I have the notes here. I had the note here. I got the note someplace in there. The thing that's interesting is you have the chief priest, and there's only supposed to be one. And I may have a note someplace later about this, but the big deal is that the Romans set this up. You only have one high priest. And by the way, the high priest is anointed, right? That's the way you make him high priest. I could have brought this stuff up. Remember when we studied the Torah, and when you made a high priest, you anointed them with a very special the ashes of the red heifer. Remember that? There was the sacrifice of the red heifer, and you had the ashes of the red heifer. And if you didn't have the ashes, you couldn't make a high priest. And by the way, what's the big deal about the priesthood today in Jerusalem, in modern Israel? Well, there's no temple, but there's a reason they can't make a high priest.
No red heifer.
There's no red heifer. And there was someone that actually recently there was a red heifer that was born. And people were saying this could be the pointer to, the next priesthood, or the next high priest, right? Because if you have a red heifer, then you can make the sacrifice. The only problem is no temple. The red heifer sacrifice is made outside of the city. And so, yeah, but there's no temple and there's no priesthood and there's no setup to be able to do this stuff. So, and this goes back, remember I told you, one of Herod's things that he did is he destroyed all the temple. He was an Edomite, and no Edomite is supposed to enter the temple what? Ever. Yeah. And so because he was an Edomite and he claimed to be king, and remember, he was never from the priesthood or kingship or anything. He's an Edomite. And so he destroyed all the records in the temple that outlined the lineage of the people. And of course, you remember they had a problem anyway, because when the lineage went to Babylon, the only males that went to Babylon were castrated. So, it's a good thing that in Hebrew culture that the Hebrew goes through the matriarch, goes through the mother, not the father. So it's not a patriarchal society. It's a matriarchal society based on your mother and not your father.
Well, in certain ways, like they still, your name and their property and everything, like with the Levirate marriages, the man had to father children for his brother or whatever, because the name and property and stuff like that went through the father.
Yeah, but still, to be a Jew, it had to go through the mother. Yeah, so
the whole lineage of Aaron and the priests, they couldn't obviously determine that either.
yeah, yeah, I think God is showing us, telling us something about this in general. But I think it's really interesting that already the priesthood had been broken. And, how did they have other, multiple chief priests? How did this occur? How could you even make it when there is no law or anything that covers it, right? So the Romans, though, were really smart because they had the priesthood every year, a different high priest. So to continue in the good graces as a high priest, you had to continue in the good graces of the Romans. And if you didn't, the Romans, you lose your prestige, you lose your position, you lose whatever, monies they got in the whole 9 yards. So very interesting. I got notes about Sanhedrin here in general. If we let them go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. And as I said, the big deal with this is, so we're worried about the temple and the nation. What are they really worried about? Their power. Because if the Romans come, how many high priests are there going to be? If the Romans are gone, there's one, right? Matter of fact, this is the big fight in Maccabees that we don't know about because we don't get to study Maccabees very much, right? But in Maccabees, the high priest took his ball, so to speak, and left. it was the high priest. What was his name? Let's say Jonas. Anyway,
There's a Jason, I'm not sure.
Jason.
I can't remember which one he was.
Well, the high priest took his ball, and many of the priests went with him to form the Essenes. And so now the Essenes were sacrificing illegally outside the temple because they were keeping up, they had the high priest. And so the high priest, by the way, during the Maccabean era, the Maccabees declared the sons to be both priest, high priest, and king, even though they weren't in the lineage of Aaron. So you have a broken system that when the Romans were invited to help get rid of the Greeks, right? The Romans took the broken system where the lineage had already been broken for the high priest in the first place, and it was maybe a Levite, but they weren't Aaronites that were in charge, and they have no idea who was really in the priesthood or the Aaronic priesthood at that point. It was completely messed up. So very interesting stuff here.
A lot of irony here too,
Yeah.
because you have the high priests who are worried that if they do nothing, the Romans will take away their temple and nation. And then you have the disciples who are frustrated because they thought Jesus was the Messiah that was going to come through and free them from the Romans.
And there's irony too in here too, because the Romans certainly did come take away the temple in their nation, despite everything that they tried to do to stop people.
Exactly. Yeah. And well, and you could argue that right now, who's in charge of everything? The Romans. They're paying tribute, right? They're paying tribute, and at the same time, the Romans have the fortress of Antonia, which is right up next to the temple, and they can look down into the temple grounds. So they're intentionally surveilling and looking after and keeping control of all the activities of the Jewish people, because they're known to be a problem. The Jews have always been a problem for, Babylon, the Assyrians, right? Even in Samaria and their own, and they even caused problems with themselves. They're the one people that would Hellenize but not Hellenize. I find that to be ironic. Most of the disciples have Greek names, so they're Hellenized, but at the same time, they're not Hellenized. I think the Chosen is pretty interesting in showing the non-Hellenized part, but I think they were a lot more Hellenized in a degree than really. Maybe it's just because of the way it is when you watch that show. You know what I'm saying? That they have the Jewish elements, but at the same time, you can see a lot of the non-Jewish elements within the culture, and I think that's really interesting. And what John is giving us, is obviously pitching this to the audience, I think Greeks and Romans. So, all right, well, cool. And of course, we're Greek-minded people, or we're supposed to be, right?
Not anymore. We're just chaotic pagans now.
Chaotic pagans, yep. That's really true in some ways.
The Jews have always been a square peg now.
Yeah.
Which I think is great, when you think about it, right?
They have different laws than everyone else.
Yeah, and they're uncompromising in it, which is the right thing, except now they're compromising within their social structure. So again, you see in America, you see the Americanization of Jewish people, right? And I think it's just like the Hellenization of Jewish people. So they have their, and you have the three groups even today. You have the Orthodox, which are trying to hold to a very strong standard. You have the kind of wishy-washy ones that are trying to hold to some standard, and then you have those that are holding to no standard at all, just kind of, but they are proud of their Jewish heritage, which is really cool. We do we have the same thing in our churches too, right? And yet, more and more liberalization of Christianity, which is going to be the demise of true Christianity if we keep going, right? Because nobody will hold a standard, right? In case that we shall send away him in this manner, all the whole just listen, they will be convinced to and into him, and they will come, the Romans, and will take up of us the spot and the ethnos. Is the translation. In case that if we shall send him away in this manner, all will be convinced of the logical argument in him, and the Romans will come and they will take us up, arise, and the spot in our place, and the people join by practicing some of our customs, our nation, our ethos. Ethos. In Greek, it's ethos. And it's interesting the words that they're using here. And here's your real irony. Then one of them named Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. Interesting. It's not exactly what he said, but it's kind of close. One of them named Caiaphas, being the high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all. One, but of a certain one or thing, from out among them, Caiaphas, high priest, he being of the cycle of a year, of that one there. He said to them, you know or not, you stare at no one or nothing. So here's what he really said. But one a certain one from out of them, Caiaphas, a high priest, he being of the cycle of that year, there. He said to them, you do not stare at nothing. You do not stare at nothing. He doesn't say you know nothing. He says you don't stare at nothing. In other words, you stare at something really important.
I thought you said that double negative were just emphasis, though, not contradicting.
It's the way that this is done, okay? Look what it says. No or not, you stare at no one or nothing. So usually in Greek, when you have a double negative, like you have uk me, right? Uk me is a double negative. Me being the one being a what do you call it? Non in Q and the other one being Q. Anyway, if you have them together, but this isn't together. This is literally you do not stare at nothing. In other words, you stare at something that is really important. So it's not really a double negative. It's a you don't stare at nothing, right? So he's saying that you're looking at something really important here, which the translation kind of misses, right? Because it says you don't see, you don't know anything. And this is what I said before. We have like about 4 different words in Greek that are translated as know. This is the stare at one. And you go, what is the writer trying to tell us? Well, we know what the writer is trying to tell us because he explains it to us. Let me see, get over here. Here's where I have this thing. The idea of the high priest being held in a cycle shows how brilliant the Romans were. They separate the priesthood by the factions within the Sadducees to divide the leaders of the Jewish people. The leaders went along with it to retain their power, and notice they could have refused the Romans by simply only acknowledging one high priest among themselves, right? But that's what they did. They went along with the Romans because, that accommodated what they wanted, which is continued power and prestige. Here, though, is what they are staring at that is something. You do not realize it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. And this is called a prophecy Like this what you get here. Nor consider that it's expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not. Not, however, you reason to a logistic, you reason to a logical conclusion, that or because it bears together, combine in a way that brings profit to you, in order that one man should die off in behalf of the people, of a people, and may not or laced, it's qualified negation versus a direct negation. Hold on, whole complete to the ethos, to the people practicing similar customs, the nation. It should be destroyed fully. So here's the translation. You not, however, reason to a logical conclusion because it bears together to you in order that one man should die off on behalf of the people, and not the whole people joined by practicing similar customs to the nations should be destroyed fully. What is really interesting about this is we're going to see what Jesus says about none of my disciples they use the same term, destroyed fully. In other words, he's worried about the nation being destroyed. Jesus was worried about his followers being destroyed. And yet, it says later, we'll see later, it says, not a single one was lost of my followers, except the one, except Judas, right? And I don't think Jesus just meant his disciples either. I think Jesus meant of all of the followers, right? We tend to focus only on the disciples, but it isn't just the disciples. It's everyone, not just the disciples. We'll see this when it's done. So in some ways, this is really interesting, and it is an ironic statement because they're concluding that it's better for one man to die for the whole nation, which, by the way, Jesus is going to die not just for the whole nation, but for the whole world, right? For all, for pas in Greek. Kind of interesting. So the fact that this gets put in the words, and by the way, we're going to see more of this, right? Because we see this when we get close to Jesus' crucifixion. Remember, John, and we talked about it before, we'll talk about it again, but remember, John is somehow connected to the high priest or to the priesthood. Is it possible that he knew what the Sanhedrin discussed because he was there or listening, or we don't get the details, right? But yet, there's another part of this story. Was John this guy? Did Jesus use him to spy on the priesthood, the Sanhedrin? I throw that out because, it certainly would make sense to me. I mean, if you're Jesus, and by the way, John was going to be called the disciple that he loved, right? Agape. Maybe he really loved him because maybe he was related. He's related to John the Baptist, who was related to not just related, was in the Aaronic priesthood, right? He was a direct descendant. It was Zechariah. Oh, if I was Jesus, what would you do? What would Jesus do? I'd send John as a spy, right? That's how you would know what was happening and what Caiaphas said. And I suspect that people didn't keep their mouths shut anyway, right?
Or would you know because of, say, Nicodemus or someone like that later told, what happened?
Yeah, I don't disagree. We don't know the source of where they got the information, but we do know, that we got John, who we'll find out is, is so well known to the priest, high priest, that he gets a pass and even brings in Simon Peter. Stone.
They were started off as the sons of thunder, then he became the apostle of love.
That Jesus loved, yeah.
Well, yeah, they always call him the apostle of love because of his later writings.
Yeah.
He's kind of a dichotomy. A lot of things.
I have a problem because every time I see when we have our prayers and stuff, and we talk about love and we read about love, and even in the things, I'm like, well, what kind of love? Right? I can't help but put agape or phileo or, something else in there because, English is all constructed via, what's the word I want to use? Context. Yeah, it's a context, right? So we pull it in context is how we understand it. But that's not how Greek works at all. So it's kind of funny to me. But yeah, all this stuff is really interesting.
Is that being connected? Do you have a lot of power?
I don't know. Interesting though, right? And you wonder, like I said, I wonder how, what was John just the one who delivered fish to him? I think it was more than that, but still. Anyway, let's see. Sabbatical, all this stuff. Yeah, anyway. 51. He did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation. Now, okay, let's look at this, and then I got something that's just an interesting observation about this. And this spake he not of himself, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus should die for the nation, for that nation. But, okay, to him, half away from of himself, no or not, he said, other contrariwise, high priest, he being in that cycle of the year, of that one there, he foretold that because it prophesied, he foretold he was intended Jesus to die off in behalf of the people, of the nation. But he did not say this from himself. Contrariwise, he being a high priest of the cycle of that year there, he foretold because he was intended Jesus to die off in behalf of the people joined by practicing similar customs. Notice a couple of things in here. Our translation says he prophesied that Jesus should die for that nation. But that's not what it says. It says he was intended Jesus to die off. In other words, who was plotting to have Jesus die off? Caiaphas. Yeah. And what's even more interesting is, okay, so John, our author, our historian, tells us this incident about Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin and everything else. This indicates even a closer point of direct observation. In other words, it's not that just Caiaphas was prophesying, but rather Caiaphas had made up his mind that Jesus should die, whatever manner, right? Instead of the nation being destroyed by the Romans. That was what he thought would happen. He thought if Jesus continued, right, then it would cause an uprising because the Messiah is supposed to cause an uprising. So therefore, we're preventing the Messiah from doing his work because we don't want an uprising because we like what we got. Whoa.
The words are a little different too. You say in the translation, he did not say for himself. Wouldn't it normally say he logically concluded?
Yeah.
But it says he did not say for himself. Is that where the prophecy comes in? Is that why they put prophecy?
He didn't make a logical argument. it was not a femi either, right? But he said it.
What word did you say is intended in Greek?
Because it uses, he was intended, emelon. He was intended, emelon, that Jesus to die off in behalf. In other words, he, the high priest, that's the, what do you call it, the nominative of the sentence. He intended that Jesus would die off. Not that Jesus would just die off, right, for the people, that he himself, and by the way, what happened, right? Pilate kept trying to get rid of it. Pilate wanted to get rid of that Jesus problem. I interviewed him how many times? 3 times? At least twice. We'll see it when we get to that point. But Pilate's trying to get rid of this guy. I don't find anything wrong. He didn't do anything wrong. I don't see anything wrong. He keeps going back. And what did the high priest? Well, the priest, right? It said the priest. It wasn't just the priest. It was. They're not okay. Are the priests going to say anything, and the high priest doesn't go, right? Say it. Or maybe with a stick. He's whacking him. Say it, right? Barabbas, not Jesus. So the high priest is the guy in charge here, and he intended from this point, well, even before this point, right? They're plotting. And so, yeah, it's a prophecy.
And an intention, both.
Yeah, and I think the Greek tells us this, right? Where our translations kind of leave it a little more wishy-washy, not sure why, but whatever, that's all right, I guess. It's just kind of funny. And not only for, and look what it says. Okay, now here's the audience John is really speaking to. And not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God to bring them together and make them one. Now this in itself is an interesting statement. Let's see what this says, right, in the Greek. We want to know what this says. And not for the nation only, but also should gather together in one the children of God that were scattered abroad. And no or not, in behalf of a people joined by similar customs, merely, contrariwise, in order that, and the tekna, the children of the theon of God, the dias corpus mina, this could be, I don't know if I have notes here for that. They having been thoroughly scattered, synagogue, he might lead together two or into one. And not merely in behalf of the people joined by practicing similar customs, contrariwise, in order that the children of the God, they having been thoroughly scattered, he might lead together into one. Okay, look at the word that is used in the Greek. It's not using the word, it doesn't say city-state, it doesn't say city, it doesn't say the laos, the people. It uses the word ethnos. Ethnos, okay, English has a very similar word, ethnos, right? And ethnos isn't just, okay, a nation. We aren't the ethnos of the United States. We are the nation state of the United States. Remember, they don't think in terms of nation states. They think in terms of city states. But when he uses the term ethnos, that would include all the Jewish people, Judeans, right? Of Judea. But not just the people in Judea. But then it goes on to make this statement about those that are scattered abroad, that are scattered away. Obviously, I think not just meaning those that are Jewish. In other words, John is talking directly to his audience here. And all the people said, yeah, because it's us. It's the Gentiles. It's the Romans. It's the Greeks. And he's speaking to both the Jews and to them, to the others, right? Saying that they, even though they're scattered, and he doesn't use the term diaspora directly. Remember, they use the term diaspora. to mean the diaspora of the Jews. This uses a different word, not entirely different word, but it's not the same word. Diaskorsomina, right? Those having been thoroughly scattered. So, yeah, I think the audience here has got this, and they are realizing this whole point. Oh, here I do have it. Okay, right here. Diascorpus from thoroughly intensifies. This is not the same as diaspora, which is used specifically, right? It has a dia, but it's scorpizio, to dissipate, which is different than the diaspora itself when that word's used. And then I give this point. Okay, this obvious tell us addressed to the hearers of the gospel. John's appealing to all the others, Greeks, Romans, the diaspora of the Jews, and any others who might be persuaded about Jesus. Very interesting. And so then it says right here, so from that day they plotted to take his life. Let's see what it says. I bet it's a little different. Then from that day that they took counsel together to put him to death. From away from that one thing, certainly or accordingly, of the period, they took counsel. Abula Sancta, they took counsel in order that they might kill him outright. Accordingly, from that one thing of a period, they took counsel in order that they might kill him outright. All right, in other words, gonna have the Romans do it? Nope. Gonna have the Greeks do it? Nope. We'll take care of it. Yeah. Not gonna hire the zealots. Gonna hire the zealots to do it? Nah, we're gonna do it ourselves.
If you want something done right, you gotta do it yourself. They're probably
very interesting. Well, because what is very okay. Did they do it themselves? No.
No, they actually did use the Romans.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, they spurred on the crowd and all that, but they used them.
Well, what's really interesting about this, and like I said, this is history. Yeah, I think this is pure history. I think John had an in. Jesus had a spy. Nicodemus maybe told him. I don't know where he got the information, but I think he got it firsthand. He knew what was going on, and I think Jesus knew what was going on. Of course, Jesus, is omnipresent, right? He's God. So they're knowing what's, and John is trying to get this. But do you guys see this? If we didn't know the end of the story, and these guys kind of do, but they kind of know, right? They want to know what else. They were asking John what else happened. So they know the rudiments, right? But they want to know the exact. And in the exact, he tells them right there, Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, Caiaphas prophesied. And he was intending to off Jesus from a long time before. But at this point, he basically convinced the Sanhedrin, which is really interesting to think about it. You got the Sanhedrin, and in the face of them is a miracle where a guy is raised from the dead. I don't know about you, but I'd kind of be like cheering Jesus at that point, right? But instead, it gives the impetus that Caiaphas needed so that now they're all in agreement that we're going to croak Jesus. And even though they didn't succeed, and by the way, do you see what for the audience? He didn't do a aside and say, but we know that the Romans crucified him, right? He leaves it open because now you got the Sanhedrin plotting to kill Jesus. Now they know the rest of the story. They know what's going to happen, but there's a mystery here, right?
I thought, wouldn't that be a problem if, for the Sanhedrin, if they had physically found a way to kill Jesus? They didn't have the legal means to kill Jesus under Roman law.
Yeah.
They couldn't do it themselves, even though that's what they were thinking they were going to do. So the only option they had was to somehow find a way to get the Romans to do the dirty work for them. So.
Yeah.
Hire a hitman.
Yeah.
And you're still a killer.
What's also interesting about this is Jesus had become too popular for them to do that, I think. it's not a hole in the wall thing. It's, he's got too many followers, too many people, and the world, we think of the world, their world is primitive, but it's not totally lawless, right? I think it's really interesting that in spite of the fact we have laws, we have all these laws. We have so many laws in the books that fill a whole wall, right? And you have all these police, and you have all these judicial means of punishing people, and yet we have probably more crime than they had in that era, right? Yeah.
Plus, if the Sanhedrin had killed him, then the people would have revolted against the Sanhedrin. That would have been a big problem. They'd have had huge fallout from that. So.
Yeah.
So they got the Romans to do it so they could blame the Romans. Oh, that wasn't us. The Romans decided to go ahead and kill him.
Yeah. I think, there are deep degrees of this whole, of everything happening here, right? And if any one element was off, it would have resulted in the destruction of the Jewish people, which, by the way, they did themselves not much later, because when you had the Essenes, where was that? Masada or whatever. When you had the Romans were cracking down on Jerusalem because there was a revolt. It wasn't Jesus' revolt, right? It was a revolt later. And by the way, that revolt, I think that God orchestrated that revolt for the purpose of the Christian diaspora.
Getting rid of the temple too, to prevent them from keeping on going with that system.
Yeah, I agree 100%, because see, this is a thing that we don't seem to teach for some reason. Why were they spending so much money in Jerusalem in the Acts? What were they eating? Remember, they were gathering together every day to eat and drink. What they were eating? The Thanksgiving sacrifice. They were doing the Thanksgiving sacrifice every day in the temple. And that costs lots of money because you got to bring in an animal, right? So God is like, okay, look, dudes, I set it up. You don't fully get it, but I'm going to fix it for you, right? And so causes this Christian diaspora, which, by the way, leads to, even more than Paul. Paul's great, I'm not taking anything away from Paul, but Paul was one guy, right? With his small group, Barnabas and, right? Roaming around with him. But that's a small group, and they had great success. But what even greater success when all of a sudden you have this Christian diaspora of Christians and Jews and Romans that suddenly are being cast into the rest of the world. Not to mention the fact that the number of the centurions, the Roman legionnaires that were embracing Christ. Whoa! What an interesting thing that is, because every time you send them on a new assignment, hey, you're going to Gaul. What they do? They told people about Christ. And by the way, there probably isn't enough credit, but I bet the legionnaires did more to push, Christianity into especially the more pagan cultures, so that eventually, what happened? The Gauls overran the Romans, but what was already happening to the Gauls? They were already Christianized to a very large extent, because the next thing you have is Byzantium, and they get overrun. But do you see this? These waves, recurrent waves,
And Constantine.
Yeah. It's really an interesting function. And, God, please don't do it. But, that's what God uses, these tumultuous events to spread Christianity, and to make sure that it's not lost and forgotten, which, is very interesting in itself. And you see how God, this is not something that you could, it would be very difficult to orchestrate this the way that it occurred, right? Because if you went one side, you'd have a great revolt. If you went the other side, it would get snuffed, right? And the way that it occurred is probably the most powerful for holding together the apostles, the disciples, and holding together this Christian faith that, faith, the Christian decision, right, that spread into the world. So, even the fact that we're listening to John tell the rest of the story, I think is really impressive to me anyway. Because we got Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then all of a sudden we got John coming on, and John is giving us the rest of the story. And by the way, it's to us, right? To the Gentile kind of fellas and folks, right? Okay. Therefore, Jesus no longer moved about publicly among the people of Judea. Instead, he withdrew to a region near the wilderness, to a village called Ephraim, and he stayed with his disciples. So this is really interesting. The Jews are the Sanhedrin is putting up so much pressure that Jesus himself withdraws. Jesus therefore walked no more openly among the Jews, but went thence to a country near to the wilderness, to a city called Ephraim, and continued with his disciples. These certainly are accordingly Jesus, not yet or no longer parahesiate, to all outspokenness. Now this is interesting, okay? Parahesiate, to all outspokenness. Peripatai, that's our word. He was walking all around into the Judeans. Contrariwise, he went off from that place to into the empty expanses, near the Ermu of the lonesome, into Ephraim. Legomenon, and it's a she. In other words, it's the gender of the noun is feminine. Made a logical argument. A town, and there he stayed in company with of the learners. So accordingly, Jesus no longer in all outspokenness was walking all around into the Judeans. Contrariwise, he went off from that place into the empty expanses near the lonesome into Ephraim, a town by a logical argument, and there he stayed in company with the learners.
What does a town by a logical argument mean?
It's really interesting because in other words, that if you saw it, you would call it a town.
Okay.
So they use this statement a lot where it says, for example, I think it'll say Golgotha, by logical argument, a skull. In other words, because it looked like a skull, right? This place looked like a town. So, and it's a mode of speaking that the Greeks have, that they're telling you, for example, Didymos, by a logical argument, a twin, because that means twin, right? But it also means that he had a twin, probably. What happened to his twin? I want to know about that, I don't think we know anything about that. Anyway, yeah, it's just a form of speaking, but it's really interesting how it fits in there. And I have for you, and this is interesting. It's not clear about whose or which learners. It doesn't say his learners. It says the learners. Look back at this. It says, and there he instead stayed in company with the learners. It doesn't say, usually when it talks about Jesus' disciples, it says of him. It uses the genitive, genitive. We use of or apostrophe s. Here, it's not his learners, it's the learners. So in other words, we're led to believe that it's a large group. And by the way, what would you expect? If the guy raised these guys from the dead, right?
Yeah. We had a lot more disciples than just the 12.
Yeah. Ephraim's apparently a larger place, a town. And so, we're getting a picture here, right? That our translation doesn't give us a better, because the translation said with his disciples, but it's not his disciples, it's the disciples. And Ephraim, we don't know much about Ephraim. I got a picture, a chart here, where we believe it is the hill country of Ephraim. Let's see. There's Jericho. Where's Jerusalem? There's Jerusalem right here. So it's kind of up. It didn't tell us that it was in Samaria, but that looks like pretty much on the edge of Samaria, right? Because Samaria is around this here. There's Bethel. These are the tribes. Ephraim is an area because that's where the Ephraimites came from, right? But like I said, there's Jericho and Jerusalem. Let's see, did it have, doesn't have like some of the newer, there's Shiloh. This is an older kind of chart. Here's a picture. In that area. And I think it's still a live town, so it's not like it's, these are just all ruins. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, many went up from the country to Jerusalem for their ceremonial cleansing before the Passover. And the Jews' Passover was nigh at hand, and many went out of the country up to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. Why did they do that? So they could eat the Passover, right? Because you had to do the mikvah. It was but near the Passover of the Judeans, and they had gone up many into Jerusalem from among the empty expanse before the Pascha, in order that to purify themselves from defilement. Okay, you notice what our translations don't include. They don't include of an empty expanse, the Chorah. It calls it just the country. But remember where it said that Jesus went? He went to Ephraim, where the empty expanse, the Chorah, same word, right? Interesting. Because here is what it says, but it was near the Passover of the Judeans, and many had gone up into Jerusalem from out among the empty expanse before the Passover in order to purify themselves from defilement. Okay, let's read into this. This doesn't say, okay, why would John even mention this? Who is this group, large group, that's going to Jerusalem from the empty expanse?
It's his learners.
Yeah,
Went with him.
yeah, it's his learners. In other words, the way that our translators give us, it's given to us to mean through the translation that it's just the normal thing, that the Judeans are going to Jerusalem for the cleansing, for the mikvah, right? But that's not what John is telling us here. He's telling us there are a lot of these people in the empty expanse that he said that's where Jesus went. Now, what are these people doing? They're going to Jerusalem to be cleansed, to the mikvah. Now, there's a lot in this. Why would so many people need to do the mikvah? Well, they want to eat the Passover, right? They want to eat the Passover. But what would have made them unclean?
Well, any number of things.
How much you want to bet that Jesus was sending them off into, look where it is in the map, right? It's right on the edge of Samaria. It's right on the edge of the Greek area, Decapolis. Decapolis is full of Gentiles. Samaria is full of Samaritans. They're considered Gentiles. Why would you need to be cleansed?
Had interactions with them.
Yeah, this is the belief, right, of their thing. So I think what was happening is Jesus made the center of his stuff Ephraim. He's out kind of, look, we think, and the picture we get, okay, is all these Romans and the Roman legion is everywhere, right? No. If you look at Centurion, the Roman legion were very cautious. They didn't send them out in small groups. Why? They might get croaked, right? Yeah. If you send them out 2 by 2, they could have been killed. So the legions went by legion, not by legion, but by the centuries. Centuries had about 80 guys. So if I send out a century, and they didn't have an innumerable number of centuries. Usually they put 2. What do they call those groups? Boy, I should remember all this stuff. It's all in my notes and my stuff. Anyway, each legion is made up of so many groups of centuries. And usually there are 10 centuries in a group, except for the first and the main. So the first and main have 6, I believe, double centuries. So all the centuries, there are 10 each. So they send them out in centuries. So if you have, usually they would have 2 groups of these main groups of 10 legions, which means I have 20 legions or 20 centuries. So how far is 20 centuries going to go if I have maybe, let's say, 1 legion in an area, like this whole area, right? Got 1 legion, maybe 2. There could have been 2, there's probably 1. So I got 20 centuries. And I'm not going to send them out in smaller groups, usually. That ain't a lot of patrol. So guess what? Jesus moving to Ephraim puts him outside of the control of the Romans, unless the Romans really want to go after him, right? And if they do, they'll go with real power. But why would you do that? Is he causing an insurrection? No, he's just kind of hanging around, People are out in the wilderness. But do you see this? That Jesus could have gathered, not 5,000, maybe 10,000, maybe a huge number of people that now are going out to the different areas, right? And by the way, if, the hearers of this, they're good Greeks and Romans, right? What are they going to ask? Who are these people coming from the lonely place? Why were they there? What was it, Ephraim? That's why the author makes the statement that by logical argument, it's a town. Because there's enough resources and people there. I think it's just a really interesting thing. We get these, very small word choices that mean a lot. It says, they kept looking for Jesus as they stood in the temple courts to ask one another, what do you think? Isn't he coming to the festival at all? Now, let's see. We have a little bit of time and we can parse this, but there's a lot to this. Okay, they sought out for Jesus, and they spake among themselves as they stood in the temple, what think ye, will he not come to the feast? They were seeking the plot of worship, certainly accordingly, Jesus, and they were making a logical argument in company with one another into the sacred place. They were standing, which were wise, suppose he seems to be to you, that are because no or not. Look at this. Here's your double negative. Who may, no or not at least, he comes or goes to and inside the festival. Certainly, they were seeking the plot of worship Jesus, and were making a logical argument in company with one another, standing into the sacred place. What suppose you, because he no not comes to the festival? All right. The impression we have from our translation is these are the normal Jews coming to Jerusalem for the Passover. That is not what it's saying exactly. It says those Jews who were in the lonely place, what? With Jesus, went to Jerusalem to the mikvah for purification so they could then have the Passover. Why they need purification? Because they were wandering around with the Gentiles and the Samaritans. And what were they expecting to see when they got to Jerusalem? Jesus. Yeah, because they went out, and now Jesus probably encouraged them, said, okay, go to purify yourself for the Passover. And what did he say? I'll meet you there. And that's where we got to cut it off for today. Thank you, Father, for your word. We pray you look after us this week. In your name we pray.